The galaxy knew humanity by its beautiful, unending sadness. It was in their art, their music, their architecture, a delicate, pervasive melancholy that the elder races found both tragic and exquisite. Human poets wrote of a fractured past, a cataclysm known only as the Great Silence, where their homeworld, Earth, had nearly consumed itself in a final, terrible war, leaving the survivors to be rescued from the brink by the benevolent stewardship. This narrative was the bedrock of human identity across the 100 scattered worlds they now called home, a story of a fallen people raised up by the grace of their cosmic elders. Humanity was the stewardship's greatest success story, a species of passionate, chaotic primitives turned into contemplative artisans, their inherent aggression sublimated into breathtaking sculptures and symphonies that wept for a past they couldn't fully remember. They were seen as fragile, grateful, and eternally indebted. It was a comfortable lie, and for 3 centuries, humanity had lived it with a quiet, dignified sorrow. Kalen served this lie from the heart of the orrery, the capital station of the stewardship, a construct of spinning golden rings and crystalline domes that orbited a trinary star system. He was an archivist, a curator of memories, spending his days in the silent, temperature-controlled halls of the Grand Archive, handing to the official histories of the junior races. His work was his devotion, a quiet act of gratitude to the beings who had saved his ancestors. He moved among the glowing data stacks with a practiced reverence, his fingers ghosting over conduits that held the meticulously edited chronicles of 1,000 worlds. He believed in the stewardship's wisdom, in the peace they had fostered, and in the tragic but necessary lesson of Earth's fall. He saw the melancholy in his people not as a wound, but as a scar that had healed into something profound. Then came the data fragment, an anomaly so small it should have been purged by the archive's sanitation demons. It appeared during a routine system integration, a sliver of corrupted code flagged for deletion from a pre-stewardship human server farm that had been in deep storage for centuries. The official record stated that all data from that era was irretrievably damaged, a casualty of the very chaos that necessitated the stewardship's intervention. But this fragment was different. It wasn't just corrupted, it was sealed, locked behind encryption so ancient it predated Galactic Common Code. Kalen's official duty was to delete it. Instead, hurried by a flicker of academic curiosity, the ghost of the historian he might have been in another life, he isolated the fragment and diverted it to a private, sandbox server in the archive's underbelly. For weeks, he worked in secret, running archaic decryption algorithms, peeling back layers of digital rust. He felt a small, thrilling guilt, like a devout monk reading a forbidden text. He told himself it was for the sake of completeness, to understand the raw, unfiltered data of his people's past before its tragic end. The first layer of encryption dissolved, and what he found was not a record of war, but of weather, atmospheric readings, magnetosphere integrity charts, solar flare projections adry, scientific log from an old Earth orbital station. It was mundane, yet it felt electric in its authenticity. The logs chronicled a period of unusual stability. The planet was at peace. Global climate initiatives were succeeding. There was no mention of escalating conflicts, no hint of the apocalyptic war that was supposed to have torn humanity apart. Instead, the final entries, dated just hours before the Great Silence, spoke of a strange, system-wide energy resonance, an anomaly detected on the edge of the Sol system. The scientist who wrote the log was puzzled, but not alarmed. His last entry was a note about calibrating deep space sensors to get a better look. Then, nothing. The log simply ended. Kalen felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The official history, the one he had curated and cherished his entire life, was built on the premise of a self-inflicted apocalypse. This data suggested otherwise. Using the fragment's unique temporal signature as a key, he began to search the deeper, more obscure corners of the Grand Archive, places where raw data was dumped and forgotten. He cross-referenced the energy resonance described in the log with the stewardship's own historical records, searching for similar phenomena. He found a match. It was a perfect one-to-one correlation, not with a weapon, but with the stewardship's most celebrated technology, the Genesis fields. These were system-wide energy networks used to terraform barren worlds and stabilize the atmospheres of developing planets. They were a symbol of the stewardship's benevolence, the tool they used to nurture and protect fledgling civilizations. The Genesis field around Vantak Prime, a Xylos colony, pulsed with the exact same frequency, the same exotic particle decay, the same resonant signature as the anomaly that had appeared in Earth's system 300 years ago. It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence, an artifact of convergent technological evolution. The feeling in his gut was no longer a knot. It was a shard of ice. He needed more, and the path forward was through the archive of the Eldrin, the senior-most race in the stewardship, the architects of the orrery itself. Their records were the most secure, sealed behind quantum locks and biosignatures. Access was unthinkable, but Kalen wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was an archivist. He knew the system's hidden pathways, the forgotten maintenance protocols, the digital back doors left by long-dead programmers. For years, he had navigated the archive's formal structures. Now, he slipped between them, a ghost in the machine he once served. He found what he was looking for in a sub-protocol file, a contingency plan for the Genesis field technology designated Protocol 734 Pacification. It was a description of an alternate function of the fields, one never mentioned in public records. It described the ability to subtly, precisely, and catastrophically destabilize a planet's magnetosphere. The protocol detailed how to overload the planetary shield from the outside, causing rapid atmospheric bleed, technological collapse through cascading electromagnetic pulses, and widespread radiation exposure. It was designed to neutralize a civilization and regress it to a pre-industrial state without ever firing a shot, without leaving a single trace of an attack. It was a weapon of immaculate destruction, leaving the target world wounded and helpless, ripe for rescue. And the final entry in the file was a deployment record. Target Sol system, third planet. Date corresponding precisely with the onset of the Great Silence. Signatory the first steward of the Eldrin. The world beneath Kalen seemed to dissolve. The gentle, wise Eldrin, with their serene expressions and patient voices, had not saved humanity. They had broken it. The Great Silence wasn't a war, it was an execution. Humanity had been on the cusp of becoming a true interstellar power, developing its own FTL drives, expanding with a speed and ferocity the ancient, slow-moving stewardship saw as a threat. So, they had cut humanity down, pruned them back like an overgrown vine, and then returned as saviors to cultivate what remained. The art, the music, the beautiful, tragic melancholy. It wasn't the echo of a suicide. It was the cry of a victim who had been forced to love their abuser. Every poem, every painting, every sad song was a monument to a lie. Kalen sat in the darkness of his hidden server room for a full day, the truth a physical weight pressing down on him. His grief was immense, a vast, hollow ache for a future that had been stolen from his entire species. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. It was a cold, quiet rage, as pristine and absolute as the vacuum of space. The stewardship had mistaken humanity's capacity for deep emotion as a weakness. They had cultivated its sorrow like a prize flower. They had failed to understand that the same species capable of such profound sadness was also capable of an equally profound fury. Kalen knew he could never fight the stewardship. He was one man, was he? Humanity was scattered, disarmed, and psychologically neutered. For centuries to be passive and grateful. A direct confrontation was impossible, but he was an archivist. His weapon wasn't a plasma rifle. It was the truth. He began to work, not with anger, but with the cold, methodical precision he had learned in the archive. He compiled the data, the original log, the energy signature analysis, the Eldrin's pacification protocol into a single, hyper-compressed data packet. He then wove this packet into the very fabric of something the stewardship celebrated human art. He chose the upcoming Solstice Festival, a galaxy-wide event where a new human symphony was set to premiere. The piece, composed by the celebrated Ilara Vance, was titled Remembrance, a somber and beautiful tribute to the stewardship's salvation of Earth. Kalen took the symphony's core audio file and, using steganographic techniques he'd theorized but never dared to use, embedded his data packet within the complex wave harmonics of the music. To any normal scan, it would be undetectable, just another layer of artistic complexity. But it was more than just hidden information. Kalen had spent years studying human history, both the sanitized official version and the fragmented, pre-silence data he had secretly collected. He had discovered something the stewardship had missed. Humans possessed a latent, dormant form of genetic memory, a psychic resonance that could be triggered by specific patterns: auditory, visual, and emotional. It was a vestigial survival trait from their violent evolutionary past, a way of passing down instinct and trauma. The stewardship's psychological conditioning had suppressed it, but the architecture was still there, sleeping in the DNA of every human. Kalen's data packet was a key, a resonant frequency coded into the symphony. When broadcast, the music would be heard by every race, but it would be felt only by humans. The key would unlock that dormant architecture, not with a sudden, violent revelation, but as a slow, creeping realization. The truth of the Great Silence would surface not as an external piece of data to be believed or disbelieved, but as an internal feeling, a shared, ancestral memory of betrayal rising from the depths of their own biology. It would reframe their sorrow not as a weakness to be cherished, but as a wound that had never healed because they were never told who had inflicted it. He renamed the file on the broadcast server, changing a single word. The symphony was no longer remembrance. It was now reckoning. As he initiated the final transfer, sending the symphony to the central broadcast network for the festival, Kalen looked out from his small viewport at the glittering rings of the orrery. The stewardship saw humanity as a collection of sad, broken artists. They were about to learn that you should never hand a weapon to an artist, because they will not use it to kill you. They will use it to rewrite the world. The calm, orderly existence he had known was over. He was no longer a grateful servant of the stewardship. He was the quiet, unassuming librarian who had just set the galaxy's biggest, most beautiful lie on fire, and he was ready to watch it burn. The hours leading up to the Solstice Festival broadcast were the longest of Kalen's life. He remained in his small, cloistered office deep within the Grand Archive, a ghost haunting the tomb of his own people's history. To any outside observer, he was the picture of diligence, running diagnostics and archiving tertiary data streams, his movements calm and economical. But inside, a silent storm raged. Every hum of the station's life support, Every soft chime of a data transfer felt like a countdown to his own execution. He had done the unthinkable, planting a seed of truth in the most fertile ground imaginable, the shared, subconscious sorrow of his entire species. The symphony, Reckoning, was now locked into the primary broadcast queue, its modified waveform authenticated and cleared by 100 unsuspecting subroutines. There was no taking it back. He watched the orrery's chronometers tick toward the appointed hour, his heart a frantic, fluttering bird in his chest. He imagined the broadcast rippling out from the orrery's central spire, a wave of sound and data washing over the galaxy. It would travel through the stewardship's comms relays to the glittering capital worlds of the Eldrin and the Xylos, to the deep space habitats of the gaseous Phone, and to the 100 scattered colonies of humanity. On Vantak Prime, Steward Vorlog of the Eldrin settled into his observation chamber, the curved walls a seamless display of the festivities across the stewardship. He was ancient, even for his long-lived race, and his face was a placid mask of wisdom and contentment. He had overseen the human portfolio for over a century, guiding their artistic development and ensuring their psychological stability. The Solstice Symphony was the culmination of his work, a testament to the stewardship's success. He saw the humans as a beautiful, melancholic masterpiece, a species saved from its own destructive nature and refined into something pure. The premiere of Ilara Vance's Remembrance was to be a moment of profound pride for him and for the entire stewardship. He adjusted the chamber's ambiance, allowing the soft, golden light to reflect off his silver robes, and prepared to be moved by the tragic beauty of his charges, thousands of light years away. On the terraform moon of Cygnus X1, known as New Appalachia, a sculptor named Lyra put down her plasma chisel. The air in her studio was thick with the scent of ozonized marble and the faint, sweet smell of the native flora. Her work was celebrated for its expression of the quintessential human condition, figures carved from stone that seemed to ache with a longing they could not name. Like all humans, she had grown up with this feeling, this gentle, pervasive sadness that was a part of her heritage. It was the price of their salvation, a constant reminder of the earth they had lost to their own folly. The Solstice broadcast was a mandatory community event, and she joined the others in the town square, settling onto a stone bench as the great holoscreen above flickered to life. She felt the familiar mix of gratitude and sorrow, ready to listen to a symphony that would once again articulate the beautiful tragedy of being human. Then the music began. The opening notes of Reckoning filled the galaxy. To Steward Vorlag, it was exquisite. The composition was even more complex and emotionally resonant than he had anticipated. The string arrangements wept with a familiar, delicate sorrow. The brass sections swelled with a noble, tragic grandeur. It was the sound of a people who understood loss, who had embraced their fragile place in the cosmos. He closed his eyes, a serene smile touching his lips. It was perfect, a perfect expression of the narrative he had so carefully maintained. But for Lyra, and for every human listening on 100 different worlds, the experience was profoundly different. The music was beautiful, undeniably so, but beneath the beauty, something was wrong. It was like hearing a familiar lullaby sung slightly off-key, a dissonance that vibrated not in the ears, but in the bones. As the first movement swelled, strange, fleeting impressions ghosted through her mind. Not memories, but the echoes of them, the glint of sunlight on a metallic sky, the taste of ash in the air, a deep resonant hum that made her teeth ache. She saw a brief, flickering image of a blue and white world, not as a paradise lost to war, but as a fortress under siege. She felt a surge of collective terror, a feeling so ancient and vast it couldn't possibly be her own. She looked around the square. Other humans were shifting uncomfortably. A man nearby had his hands pressed to his temples. A woman was staring at her own hands as if she'd never seen them before. The sadness they had all carried their entire lives was changing. The soft, melancholic ache was sharpening, crystallizing into something colder, harder. It was the feeling of a phantom limb, the ghost of a weapon that had been ripped from their grasp. In the orrery, Kaylin watched the biofeedback network, a restricted data stream that monitored the general well-being of the stewardship's populations. The feeds from the Eldrin, the Xylos, and the other elder races were placid, showing gentle spikes of aesthetic pleasure in response to the music. The human feed, however, was a chaotic storm. Neurological activity was spiking in unison across all their colonies. Latent psychic resonance, a metric the stewardship dismissed as primitive spiritualism, was surging off the charts. It wasn't a signal being sent, it was a connection being reestablished. A web of shared consciousness, dormant for 3 centuries, was lighting up, node by node, human by human. The music wasn't just being heard, it was being recognized. The second movement began, faster and more discordant. Steward Vorlog frowned slightly. The composition was taking a turn he didn't expect. The sorrow was still there, but it was now laced with a thread of something else, a defiant, angry pulse. It was less a lament and more an accusation. In Lyra's mind, the fleeting images grew clearer. She saw vast, silver ships hanging in a silent sky. She felt the ground shake, not from an explosion, but from a deep, planetary groan. She felt the suffocating helplessness of being trapped, of watching a shield of blue light flicker and die. And she felt a burning, unadulterated rage. It was the rage of the betrayed, of the deceived, of the caged. The art in her hands, the life she had built, the very identity she cherished, it all felt like a lie. A beautiful cage built around a forgotten wound. The final movement of the symphony arrived not with a sorrowful resolution, but with a crashing, searing crescendo that was pure, unbridled fury. It was the sound of a star breaking, of a promise being shattered, and woven into the wall of sound was a single and repeating resonant frequency the key Kaylin had crafted. Across the galaxy, in that one shared moment, the lie broke, the genetic memory unlocked. Humans everywhere felt it at once, the truth of the Great Silence. They remembered the silver ships of the Eldrin. They remembered the Genesis field weaponizing their sky. They remembered not a civil war, but a silent, unprovoked execution. They remembered that they had not fallen. They had been pushed. The symphony ended. For a long moment, there was a profound silence across all human worlds. No applause, no weeping, just a stillness heavy with a terrible new clarity. Then, on New Appalachia, Lyra did something she had never done before. She looked up at the stewardship emblem on the hollow screen, the symbol of her saviors, and she felt nothing but cold, unyielding hatred. She picked up her plasma chisel, not with the hand of an artist, but with the grip of a soldier. In his chamber, Steward Vorlog was baffled. The symphony's end was abrupt, discordant, and deeply unsatisfying. It was a failure of composition. He was about to contact the cultural ministry when the first reports began to trickle in. Minor work stoppages on human-run mining colonies. A sudden, complete communications blackout from the agricultural world of New Eden. A human pilgrimage vessel, the Wanderer's Hope, had just deviated from its flight plan without explanation, its destination unknown. The reports were small, isolated incidents, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something had happened to the humans. They had all gone silent at once. Kalen saw his window closing. The stewardship's analysts were the best in the galaxy. They would dissect the symphony, find the anomalous data, and trace its point of origin back to his terminal. He had hours, perhaps a day at most. He initiated the final phase of his plan. He wasn't just a saboteur, he was a liberator of truth. He set a series of cascading demons to purge his existence from the orrery's logs, creating a false trail that pointed to a long-dead data smuggler. While the system was busy chasing his ghost, he turned his full access as a senior archivist toward his true target, the Vault of Origins. This was the most heavily encrypted section of the Grand Archive, containing the true, unredacted histories of every species the stewardship had pacified and saved. It was a library of genocides, a testament to the Eldrin's centuries-long campaign of galactic control, all hidden behind the lie of benevolence. He began the download, a torrent of forbidden knowledge pouring into a shielded data core he had built piece by piece over the last month. He was stealing the evidence of their crimes, a weapon far more powerful than any fleet. As the final data packet transferred, he permitted himself one last act of defiance. He accessed the core system log, the immutable record of the Grand Archive, and left a single anonymous entry, a message he knew his newly awakened people would one day find. It read, "The sadness was a cage. The key was the song. Find the archivist." Then, with the data core secured in a shielded satchel, Kalen slipped out of his office and into the service corridors of the station. He was no longer an archivist, a curator of lies. He was a fugitive, the keeper of a truth that would either free his species or see them annihilated. The beautiful, sad artists were awake now, and their first act would be to seek the man who had taught them how to hate again. He had to reach them before the stewardship reached him. The reckoning had just begun. The silence that fell across the 100 human worlds was not one of peace, but of a held breath. On New Appalachia, Lyra stood amidst the frozen crowd in the town square, the echo of the symphony's final, furious chord still ringing in her soul. The beautiful sadness that had been the bedrock of her identity, the lens through which she viewed the world, had shattered. In its place was a landscape of sharp, cold clarity. She looked at the faces around her, the farmer, the engineer, the poet, and saw not the gentle, melancholic artists the stewardship had cultivated, but the descendants of survivors, their eyes reflecting a shared, 300-year-old memory of fire and betrayal. There was no panic, no screaming. The awakening was too profound for such chaotic expressions. It was a collective, internal shift, as if an entire species had opened its eyes in the same instant to find itself in a cage it had mistaken for a sanctuary. A technician from the comms tower, a young man named Ben, was the first to act. His hands trembled as he keyed commands into a portable data pad, his face pale. "It's in the music," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "There's something else in the signal, a data packet, hidden in the harmonic layers. It's a history, the real history." He projected the data onto the holoscreen, replacing the stewardship's emblem with fragmented text files and energy readings, Kalen's meticulously compiled evidence. And at the end of it all, a single, anonymous log entry left in the orrery's core system. The sadness was a cage. The key was the song. Find the archivist. The words acted as a focusing lens for their newfound rage. It wasn't enough to know the truth. They needed the source. They needed the one who had dared to give it to them. The message became a rallying cry, spreading like wildfire across the newly awakened network of human consciousness. On worlds separated by light years, the same scene played out. Artisans laid down their tools, not in protest, but in preparation. Poets began to write, not of sorrow, but of war. The scattered colonies of humanity, kept isolated and culturally distinct by stewardship design, began to reach out to one another, their communications networks lighting up with a purpose they had never known. For the first time in 3 centuries, they were no longer 100 colonies. They were one people. Lyra, the sculptor who had once carved grief from stone, found herself at the center of this nascent rebellion on her world. Her cold, focused calm was a magnet for the others. "They lied about our past," she said, her voice steady and clear, addressing the crowd that had gathered around the comms tower. "They will lie about this. They will say this is mass hysteria, a flaw in our genetics. They will come to sedate us, to fix us." She held up her plasma chisel, its cutting edge humming with latent power. "We will not be fixed." Meanwhile, in the pristine, golden heart of the stewardship, chaos was taking root. Steward Vorlag watched the incoming reports with a growing sense of dread. The human colonies were not just silent. They were coordinating. Trade shipments were being recalled. Human delegates in the outer sectors were abandoning their posts. Civil infrastructure was being quietly and methodically repurposed. It wasn't the disorganized riot of a primitive species. It was the cold, calculated preparation for war. It was the symphony. His chief of security, a pragmatic Xylos named Prax, reported, his 4 optical sensors blinking rapidly. The broadcast signal was compromised. "We've isolated a steganographic data weapon embedded in the final movement. It's an information plague, designed to trigger a specific, latent neurological response in humans." Vorlog felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. A weapon disguised as art. The concept was almost incomprehensibly perverse to him. Art was meant to soothe, to elevate. Who would do this? Who has this capability? The point of origin is internal, Prax stated flatly, bringing up a schematic of the orrery. The packet was uploaded from a terminal within the Grand Archive. Vorlog felt the ground shift beneath him. The archive was his domain, a place of silent, scholarly order. The idea that such a violent act could originate from its heart was a deep, personal violation. "Seal the archive," Vorlog commanded, his voice losing its serene edge for the first time in decades. "I want the identity of every archivist with sufficient access. I want the one responsible." Kalen knew the hunt had begun. He moved through the orrery's forgotten spaces, a fugitive in the home he knew better than anyone. He stayed away from the grand, monitored causeways, instead using the humming, metallic guts of the station as his highway. He slid through cramped maintenance ducts, the data core a solid weight against his back, and navigated the labyrinthine waste reclamation conduits, the stench of recycled air and ozone thick in his throat. He was not a spy or a soldier. He was a librarian. His only weapons were his knowledge of the system's hidden architecture and the desperate, burning need to survive. He knew he couldn't stay on the orrery. It was the most secure location in the galaxy. His goal was the underside, the sprawling, chaotic docking bays that serviced the thousands of independent freighters that moved cargo for the stewardship. It was a place of lax security and transient populations, his only real chance of escape. As he worked his way downward, level by level, station-wide alerts began to chime. First, a general security warning, then a lockdown of all official transport hubs. He felt the net tightening. He had to get to a ship before his identity was discovered. He found his chance in Bay 794, a grimy, poorly lit hangar reeking of spilled hydro fuel and cheap synth ale. It was home to the dregs of the Galactic shipping trade. His eyes landed on a battered, ugly freighter, the Stardust Drifter, its hull scarred with 1,000 micrometeor impacts. Its captain, a human named Jax, was a relic of a forgotten age, a cynical, grizzled man who had been born on the fringes and still carried the restless, defiant energy the stewardship had tried so hard to breed out of his people. Kalen approached him not as a desperate fugitive, but as a client. "I need passage," Kalen said, his voice quiet but firm. "Off station. No questions. The destination is the Kepler Belt, near the human colony of Meridian." He offered Jax a data chip containing restricted star charts for a newly opened mining sector, a small, valuable piece of information he had lifted from the archive. Jax eyed him with suspicion. His gaze lingering on the shielded satchel Kalen clutched. "Kepler's a dead zone, and you look like you're running from something a lot worse than a bad debt. The price is for your discretion as much as your FTL drive," Kalen replied, his calm demeanor a carefully constructed facade. Greed won out over caution. Jax grunted his assent and motioned toward the freighter's ramp. "Get on. We lift in 20. Just as Kalen stepped onto the ship, the bay's klaxons blared to life. The soft, ambient lighting was replaced by flashing red strobes. A synthesized voice echoed through the hangar, cold and authoritative. "Security alert. Station-wide manhunt in effect. Subject is Kalen, senior archivist of the Terran Histories. Considered an agent of sedition. Lethal force is authorized." Kalen's face, pulled from his official records, appeared on every monitor in the bay. Jax swore, his hand instinctively going to the heavy plasma pistol holstered at his hips. "Archivist sedition. What in the blazes did you do to read a forbidden book?" "I wrote a new chapter," Kalen said, his eyes pleading with the captain. "They know. We have to go now." For a moment, Jax hesitated. Harboring a fugitive of this magnitude was a death sentence. But then he looked at Kalen's face on the screen, then back at the quiet, terrified man before him. He saw the same spark of defiance he nurtured in himself. He slammed his fist on the ramp control. "Strap in, bookworm," he growled. "This is gonna be a rough takeoff." The Stardust Drifter's engines roared to life with a bone-jarring shudder. As the ramp sealed, Kalen saw stewardship security skiffs, sleek, predatory vessels, swarm into the docking bay, their weapon ports glowing. The freighter blasted out of its docking clamps, scattering cargo containers and personnel droids. It tore through the bay doors and into the void, a tiny, desperate ship fleeing the golden, glittering heart of a dying empire. Kalen was thrown against a bulkhead, the data core digging into his spine, a painful reminder of the truth he carried. He had escaped the orrery, but he was now adrift in a galaxy that was hunting him, on a ship with a captain he didn't trust, heading toward a people he had awakened but had not yet met. The archivist was free, but his story was just beginning. The Stardust Drifter was a wounded animal screaming through the void. Alarms blared in the cramped cockpit, a chaotic symphony of imminent system failure. Jax wrestled with the controls, his knuckles white, his face a mask of grim concentration. Behind them, the pursuit was relentless. It wasn't a standard stewardship patrol. It was the Silent Hand, an elite Eldrin fleet of ghost white interceptors. Ships designed for hunting, not policing. They moved with a predatory grace that made Kalen's blood run cold, their plasma bolts stitching the darkness around the freighter's straining shields. "They're hurting us," Jax grunted, sweat beading on his forehead as he dodged a volley of fire that slagged a nearby asteroid into glowing dust. "They don't want to destroy us. They want the package." He nodded back at Kalen, who was strapped into the co-pilot seat, clutching the data core to his chest as if it were his own heart. "What did you show them?" "Bookworm," Jax yelled over the alarms. "What's in that box that's worth sending out the boogeymen?" Kalen's mind, accustomed to the quiet order of the archives, was struggling to keep up with the violent reality of their flight. He knew he owed the captain more than a cryptic comment. He owed him the truth. With trembling fingers, he unlatched a small interface port on the data core and jacked it into the ship's secondary console. "I'll show you," he said, his voice strained. He didn't bring up the files on Earth. He brought up a different file, one he had found deep within the vault of Origins. The file was labeled Kirin Pacification. On the screen, vibrant civilization bloomed, and the Kirin, a species of elegant, crystalline beings, were shown in their prime building cities of light, charting star systems with their solar sail ships, their culture a dazzling display of scientific and artistic achievement. Then, the video shifted. An Eldrin Salvation fleet arrived, identical to the one that had appeared in Earth's sky. A Genesis field was deployed, not to terraform, but to subtly alter the planet's resonant frequency, a change that was harmless to most life, but catastrophically disruptive to the Kirin's crystalline biology. The footage became a silent horror film. The Kirin's luminous bodies began to fracture. Their cities of light dimmed, their consciousness splintered. They didn't die. They were broken, reduced to a state of childlike confusion. The final clip showed the Eldrin landing as saviors, offering a cure for their sudden, inexplicable genetic decay. The modern Kirin were now a stewardship protectorate, known for their simple, beautiful wind chimes and their placid, grateful smiles. Jax stared at the screen, his cynical swagger gone, replaced by a cold, silent fury. He had traded with the Kirin. He'd always found them a bit simple, a bit sad. "They didn't just conquer them," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "They lobotomized an entire species and called it mercy." The lie he had lived with his whole life, that humanity was a unique tragedy, crumbled. They weren't the only ones. They were just the latest victims in a pattern of galactic subjugation so vast and insidious it defied imagination. His fight was no longer about a big payout. It was about payback. Back in the orrery, Steward Vorlog watched the pursuit on his main tactical display. The precision of the silent hand was flawless, but the hunt for the fugitive was only one part of his strategy. The more urgent battle was for the narrative. "The plague of psychosis spreads," he announced to his council, his voice once again a mask of serene authority. "The human psyche, inherently unstable, has fractured under the resonant frequencies of the Solstice Symphony. Their coordinated actions are not a sign of rebellion, but of a shared tragic delusion." He initiated the stewardship's countermeasure, the Benevolence Protocol. Across the galaxy, Eldrin medical ships were dispatched to human colonies, not with weapons, but with offers of aid. They broadcast messages of deep concern, promising a cure for the melancholy collapse, a neurological condition they had invented moments before. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. They were positioning themselves as healers, ready to pacify the very people they had poisoned, framing any resistance as the irrational actions of the sick and insane. "We will save them from themselves." Once again, Vorlog concluded, the lie tasting like truth on his tongue. The Benevolence Protocol was met with cold defiance. On New Appalachia, Lyra watched the Eldrin medical frigates enter orbit, their hulls gleaming white against the blackness of space. Their messages of concern were broadcast on every channel, gentle voices offering salvation, but the humans were no longer listening. The awakening had rewritten their souls. Lyra had become the de facto leader of a nascent resistance, her artist studio now a command center. They think we are sick, she said to the assembled colonists, her voice amplified across the town square. They are right. We have been sick with a beautiful lie for 300 years. Now, we are finally cured. The problem was communication. The stewardship controlled the standard FTL comms network. To coordinate a defense, to find their archivist, they needed their own path. Ben, the young comms tech, provided the answer. He had discovered the EchoNet, a network of defunct, pre-stewardship military communication satellites. Ghost hardware left drifting in the darkness. It was slow, antiquated, and completely off the stewardship's grid. It was perfect, working feverishly. The human colonies began to restore the network, one satellite at a time. It was a painstaking process, a digital archaeology project conducted on a galactic scale. Soon, the EchoNet was alive, a secret web of light connecting the 100 worlds. Their first priority was a desperate search for a single, battered freighter. Sifting through trillions of bytes of public shipping data, they found a vessel named the Stardust Drifter had made an unauthorized, high-velocity departure from the orrery at the exact moment of the lockdown. Its flight plan filed for the Kepler belt. It was a whisper in a hurricane, but it was all they had. In the chaos of the Kepler belt, Jax pushed the drifter to its absolute limit. He dove into a dense asteroid field, the ship's hull groaning as chunks of ice and rock scraped along its shields. "Can't shake 'em," he snarled. "Their scanners are too good." Kalen, his mind racing, scanned the stolen star charts. He was looking for something he had only read about in fragmented, pre-silence logs, a place called the Boneyard. It was a fleet graveyard, a place where humanity's old warships were scuttled after the stewardship had gifted them new, disarmed technology. There, Kalen pointed, his finger tracing a path through a treacherous gravitational eddy. That debris cluster, it's not natural. Following Kalen's coordinates, Jax plunged the freighter into the cluster. They emerged into a strange, silent cathedral of steel. All around them floated the colossal, skeletal remains of a forgotten fleet. Dozens of dark, angular ships, bristling with weapon emplacements that hadn't been seen in centuries, drifted in a silent, ghostly formation. It was humanity's pre-stewardship navy, the Ghost Fleet. The Silent Hand interceptors followed them in, their white hulls a stark contrast to the dark, dormant warships. The drifter was cornered, its engines sputtering, its shields failing. Jax pulled his plasma pistol from its holster. "Well, bookworm," he said, a grim smile on his face. "It's been an educational trip." Kalen clutched the data core, his heart sinking. He had brought the truth out of the darkness, only to die with it in a graveyard of his ancestors' power, just as the Eldrin ships locked their weapons for the final, disabling shot. A single, static-laced word crackled over the drifter's speakers, broadcast on an ancient, encrypted channel. "Stand by." A light blinked on Jax's console, a signal from the lead dreadnought of the Ghost Fleet, a ship that had been dead for 300 years. Then, Lyra's voice, clear and steady, cut through the static, transmitted across the vastness of space via the EchoNet and relayed through the old warship's comm system. "This is the human colony of New Appalachia calling the Stardust Drifter. We see you, Archivist." Kalen looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Outside the viewport, across the hull of the dead dreadnought, running lights flickered to life, one after another, like a constellation being born in the darkness. Then another ship, and another. Power signatures, dormant for centuries. began to flare across the boneyard. "You are not alone," Lyra's voice promised. "And you have brought us the keys to our inheritance." The archivist had found his people, and they had just found their teeth. The boneyard ceased to be a graveyard and became a crucible. As the first Eldrin plasma bolt struck the drifters' failing shields, Kalen's data core became the heart of a resurrected war machine. "They're not just ships," he yelled, his fingers flying across the console, interfacing directly with the lead dreadnought. The Vengeance. Their shells, the AIs, the tactical doctrines, the power routing protocols, the stewardship made us delete them, but they didn't know we made backups. He was uploading the ghosts back into the machines. On the main view screen, the dark, silent warships came alive. Hull plating shifted. Weapon ports slid open with a grinding shudder of ancient metal, and engines ignited with cores of cold, blue fury. These were not the elegant, energy-efficient drives of the stewardship. They were brutal, power-hungry engines of war. The silent hand, accustomed to swift, surgical strikes, found themselves facing something they had only read about in redacted histories, a human battle doctrine. The Ghost Fleet didn't move with the cold logic of modern fleets. The resurrected AIs, built on the personalities of long-dead human captains, were unpredictable, aggressive, and viciously creative. They used asteroids for cover, feigned reactor breaches to lure the Eldrin into kill boxes, and linked their fire in overlapping, inescapable waves of destruction. Jax, with a savage grin, piloted the drifter like a madman, acting as a spotter, darting between the colossal warships and painting targets for the dreadnought's massive railguns. The pristine white interceptors of the Silent Hand were torn apart, their elegant designs no match for the sheer, unapologetic violence of humanity's past. Within 30 minutes, the boneyard was once again a graveyard, but this time it was filled with the wreckage of the galaxy's most feared fleet. News of the Silent Hand's annihilation broke across the stewardship like a shockwave. The narrative Vorlog had carefully constructed of a sick, delusional species needing his gentle hand was shattered against the hard reality of a resurrected navy. On 100 worlds, the junior races watched, their gratitude to the stewardship suddenly tainted by a terrifying new respect for humanity. Vorlog, cornered in his observation chamber on the orrery, felt the foundations of his empire crack. His authority rested on the perception of serene, unbeatable power. That perception was now in flames. Humiliation curdled into rage. "They have chosen plague over cure," he broadcast to the entire galaxy, his voice a veneer of sorrow over a core of iron. "With heavy hearts, we must act to cauterize this infection before it spreads. The source of the delusion is Earth. We will bring peace to the origin of their pain." The message was clear. He was going to finish the job. A stewardship armada, the largest fleet assembled in a century, began its slow, inexorable journey toward the Sol system. The Genesis field emitter at its heart. The EchoNet burned with the news. There was no debate, no hesitation. From every corner of human space, the newly christened Reckoning Fleet answered the call. The old warships, refueled and rearmed from hidden pre-stewardship caches revealed in Kalen's data core, made a series of desperate FTL jumps, pushing their ancient drives to the breaking point. They arrived in the Sol system just as the Eldrin Armada was taking up its final position, the Genesis field emitter beginning its deadly charge, a shimmering distortion of reality aimed at the blue and white world that hung in the void. Humanity was outmatched and outgunned, but they had one weapon left. On the bridge of the Vengeance, Lyra stood beside Kalen and Jax, a sculptor turned admiral. She looked not at the enemy fleet, but at the archivist, "It's time," she said. "The whole truth. For everyone." Kalen nodded, his hand steady now. He had spent his life curating lies. Now he would curate a revolution. He bypassed the standard comms channels, using the combined power of the Reckoning Fleet's transmitters to hijack every broadcast network in the galaxy, from the high-frequency diplomatic channels of the Eldrin to the public entertainment feeds of the most remote outer worlds. And he sent them the contents of the Vault of Origins. The galaxy went silent as it watched. They saw the Kirin, their crystalline minds fractured by a song. They saw the winged avian of Parnassus, their hollow bones made brittle by an atmospheric purification. They saw a dozen other vibrant, proud species, each one subtly broken, pacified, and then saved by the benevolent stewardship. They saw a pattern of galactic conquest so patient and monstrous it dwarfed any conventional war. The broadcast was not just a history lesson, it was an indictment. Aboard the ships of the Eldrin Armada, the Xylos pilots, the Phone engineers, and the countless other junior races that made up the bulk of the stewardship's military watched the truth of their masters. They saw their own histories reflected in the fates of the Kirin and the humans. Their loyalty, built on generations of grateful servitude, disintegrated in a matter of minutes. As the Genesis field reached full power, Vorlog gave the command to fire. Nothing happened. Across his tactical display, the readiness indicators of his fleet began to blink out, one by one. A Xylos captain, his voice shaking with a rage his species was not supposed to possess, opened a channel to the Vengeance. "We will not be your scalpel," he declared. "Not anymore." Ship after ship from the Armada turned, not to retreat, but to aim their weapons directly at Vorlog's flagship. The stewardship's military might, its greatest tool of control, had dissolved from within, defeated not by plasma or railguns, but by a simple, undeniable truth. Vorlog was alone, adrift in a sea of his own lies, his authority utterly and irrevocably gone. In the aftermath, the galaxy reshaped itself. The stewardship did not fall in a great war, but crumbled into irrelevance. A new coalition of worlds began to form, founded not on a hierarchy of benevolence, but on a pact of mutual respect and remembrance. Humanity, the catalyst for this great unraveling, did not step in to fill the power vacuum. On the bridge of the Vengeance, orbiting a safe and silent Earth, Lyra broadcast one final message. "We will not rule," she said, her voice echoing across a newly awakened galaxy. "We have seen what happens when one species decides it knows what is best for all. Our tragedy will not become our mandate. Instead, we will be what the galaxy needs. We will be its memory. We will be the archivists of the truth." Kalen returned to the orrery, not as a fugitive, but as the first curator of a new grand archive, one open to all datates with no sealed vaults or redacted histories. Jax, captain of a newly commissioned ship, the Truth-Sayer, ran not contraband, but emissaries and historians between worlds, reconnecting cultures that had been isolated for centuries. And on New Appalachia, Lyra returned to her studio. She picked up her plasma chisel and began to carve. She was not sculpting a monument to war or victory. She was sculpting a human figure, not weeping with a beautiful, unending sadness, but with its head thrown back in a defiant, joyous shout, its hands not open in supplication, but clenched into fists of purpose. The age of sorrow was over. The age of reckoning had given way to a new, more difficult, and far more honest era, the age of being awake. And in the quiet hum of her studio, surrounded by the scent of stone and stars, Lyra knew that humanity had finally, after a long and terrible silence, found its true voice.